Null and void. I'm Jessica Denson, and this is Lights On. Null and void is what the Constitution of the United States of America demands that we do with the Trump administration. This administration has been illegal from day one per Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. We have an absolute obligation to abide by that constitutional demand and an opportunity to. It's past time that our democratic lawmakers and all of our lawmakers start reading the room as to the temperature in this country and what the people want us to do to exercise our constitutional authority to stop this authoritarian descent in the United States of America in 2025. It is obscene. This week, we were subjected to another spectacle of the so-called president, leader of the free world, bringing in the president of South Africa, subjecting him to this ludicrous fantasy of non-existent white genocide in South Africa. And we have this entire media conversation and pundits talking about how is the world supposed to handle this leader who is such a mockery, such a joke, such a embarrassment to what democracy and the United States stands for. And we actually have a mechanism that prohibits him and his entire administration from being in power in the first place. As you know, if you were a regular on Lights On, I founded a movement, a grassroots movement back in January called 14 Now. And I will forever be a champion of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. This man committed a deadly insurrection on this country, tried to stay in power against the will of the people, was adjudicated in multiple venues to have committed that deadly insurrection. No actual guilty conviction in a court of law is required by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the fact that we just steamrolled past that allowed a man who both caused the death of police officers on the day and caused many to take their own lives in the wake of that day, and has since pardoned and given aid and comfort to his fellow insurrectionists who committed seditious conspiracy. The fact that we have bludgeoned through that constitutional safeguard and are now subjected to this daily spectacle and obliteration of our constitutional rights, violation of court orders, is not something that we should be standing for 1 second. You know, one of the things that I could not help but noticing this week as we were listening to this ludicrous notion of a white genocide in South Africa is that, of course, we have an actual genocide going on right now in Gaza. And those brave individuals, patriotic, convicted to human rights and the freedom of all people who have spoken out against that genocide in this country, are being treated as terrorists, are having their free speech rights stripped from them. Mahmoud Khalil is one example, one of the first. This week, he was able, by the judge overseeing his case, to see his baby, his newborn baby, for the first time. The cruelty of this administration literally took this legal resident, scholar of Columbia University, out of his home when his wife was pregnant so that he could not see his newborn baby. That is the level of cruelty that we're dealing with. He was protesting genocide, an actual genocide that our government has been complicit in. And he was deported to a prison in Louisiana for having convicted no crime and is being kept from his newborn baby. That is the level of violation of human rights, while we are subjected to a spectacle of a non-existent genocide by an illegal president in the White House. Every single one of these acts, every single daily intrusion into our rights and our freedoms can and should be stopped. We have to be demanding that our lawmakers acknowledge Donald Trump's disqualification. This show was like a one note instrument for the month of December, trying to educate the public and get the public to put pressure on our lawmakers about the ramifications of Trump v. Anderson, which was the Trump disqualification case, why it did not in any way, shape, or form take away his status as an adjudicated insurrectionist, and why our lawmakers had an obligation to acknowledge that status and block his presidency from the first place. But because they failed, one thing remains, and that is that every single action, not just by the nature of its illegality and unconstitutionality in whatever respect it is violating the Constitution, but by the very nature of it having come from a disqualified insurrectionist, every action of this illegal administration is just that, illegal, null, and void. You know, there's been some conversation about the intense gaslighting going on by the extreme right these days, by, for instance, Matt Gaetz on a podcast, on Steve Bannon's podcast. One of the things that he has been arguing and saying, and what a sick construct that this sexual abuser, Matt Gaetz, is someone who is the, intellectual North Star for the right-wing MAGA in this country right now. But he said to Steve Bannon, he said, the biggest test for the Trump administration is, are they willing to defy court orders? Are they willing to defy court orders? They're saying it so out loud, and yet they're cloaking themselves. They're cloaking this authoritarianism in the guise of constitutionality. What he said is, it's the biggest case, what we're witnessing right now with judges doing their jobs and stopping this administration from their unthinkable tyrannical overreach. He said, this is the biggest case of Article 3 subversion since the Civil War. Well, I would argue that we have the biggest case of Section 3 subversion since the Civil War. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which, by the way, it was established to give humanity and citizenship to non-white people, fundamental foundation of equality in this country, has been subverted in this year, in 2025, in a way that history will look back on with no favors, with no forgiveness for our unwillingness to uphold this fundamental constitutional safeguard. My guest today, who's going to be joining me in just a few minutes, is Professor Evan Bernick of Northern Illinois University. He is author of The Original Meaning of the 14th Amendment. I've been so honored and happy to have him on at several points over the past few months to really give us a proper education of the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the way it empowers our lawmakers and our courts, and why it is so vital that we do not forget about the 14th Amendment right now. I have a lot of very in-depth questions for him, including questions that you have been asking me. And this show is very much for you in response to a lot of the questions that you have been coming to me recently with about the 14th Amendment, about why we're not seeing litigation, about why we're not seeing action in Congress, why we're not seeing an Amnesty Act. What are our options? What are our remedies? By the way, if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe now to the Jessica Denson YouTube channel. You know I do this show because I cannot lay down and go away and be silent in a moment in history like this. There are other things that I would like to be doing, but I can't live with myself being an American citizen in this moment in history when unthinkable regression is being threatened and oppression. And so I do this show, Lights On, for you. I do it as a movement. You've been part of this with me in such a beautiful way. And we have the ripples that this show has made cannot be overstated. We have had such an impact in the impeachment conversation, which, by the way, I'm not abandoning that either. You will not see Lights On or Jessica Denson abandon any constitutional remedy that we have for removing this man from power now. You will never see lights on tell you that we should wait till the midterms to rectify this. We need to rectify this now. So your support of this show is greatly, greatly appreciated. I just wanted to bring up one more thing before I bring in Evan to speak with us today, and that is the most recent deportations. We know, of course, know that Donald Trump has been sending people to the equivalent of concentration camps in El Salvador, CICAT, concentration camps. He wants to eradicate due process. Another thing his ludicrous, unqualified, and illegal administration said this week from Kristi Noem was that habeas corpus is the right of the president to remove people from the country. Not anywhere near what habeas corpus is. Habeas corpus is due process. And we, of course, know this administration has repeatedly, in defiance of court orders, denied people of their due process rights. And this week, a U.S. District Judge, Brian E. Murphy in Massachusetts, issued a ruling saying that the United States government must keep eyes and can basically know where people are that they are literally sending to South Sudan. The Trump administration, the illegal Trump administration, has begun deporting people from Myanmar and Vietnam, some places where they experience political unrest and persecution, and have come here for real needed refugee status, not fake refugee status like the white Afrikaners from South Africa, but really needed refugee status. They've begun to deport these individuals to South Sudan, despite a court order restricting removals to other countries. This is how the U.S. State Department's annual report on South Sudan, published in April of last year, defined that country. It said they have significant human rights abuses that include arbitrary killings, disappearances, torture, or inhumane treatment by security forces, and extensive violence based on gender and sexual identity. This is the country. This is another one of the countries, in addition to the concentration camp in El Salvador, where the illegal Trump administration has chosen to deport legal migrants in defiance of court orders. And we're supposed to wait for the midterms. We're supposed to wait for the midterms to rectify this. J.D. Vance, the illegal vice president, this week said, because they were elected, which, by the way, I don't believe either that this election was fair for 1 second. But he said, because they were elected, what they say goes. Courts cannot stand in the way. That is, of course, something that anyone who has passed a basic civics class, let alone graduated from Yale Law School, knows is not how the Constitution and the separation of powers works. And in this big, blusterous, barbaric, brutal bill that Donald Trump is trying to force through to chop the most needed services to those who need them most and give tax cuts to the rich, he's also got in there a provision that unilaterally and secretly allows him, the illegal president, Donald Trump, to designate any groups as terrorist organizations, any groups that he wants as terrorist organizations. Now, we've already seen this framing of terrorism in this phony war on anti-Semitism, while Donald Trump is literally in the Middle East meeting with the biggest enemies of Israel and flouting Israel. This whole joke about caring about anti-Semitism is really disgusting. But I often cite On Tyranny, it's the motto for this show, stand out, is from this book. But I want to read another chapter just real quick before I bring Evan in. And it's chapter 17. It says, listen for dangerous words. Be alert to the use of the words extremism and terrorism. Be alive to the fatal notions of emergency and exception. Be angry about the treacherous use of patriotic vocabulary. And that's what these people, in the name of the Constitution, Stephen Miller, literally on the lawn of the White House a couple weeks ago, was saying that the Constitution is the law of the land, and in the same breath said that they might do away with habeas corpus. So they try to merge. They use the juxtaposition of these completely antithetical concepts in trying to justify to their blinded followers their onslaught of tyranny. But here's what Timothy Snyder says. He says, dissidents of the 20th century, whether they were resisting fascism or communism, were called extremists. Modern authoritarian regimes such as Russia use laws on extremism to punish those who criticize their policies. In this way, the notion of extremism comes to mean virtually everything except what is, in fact, extreme: tyranny. And that is exactly what we are dealing with right now. We are dealing with tyranny. We are dealing with a man who is treasonous in his intentions and actions against this country, who has committed and incited a deadly insurrection. We cannot ignore that. It is my pleasure, as always, to be joined by my friend, Professor Evan Bernick. Professor Bernick, welcome back to Lights On.
Thank you, Jessica. And I frankly don't even know what you need me for at this point. I mean, your command of the issues at stake, your understanding of the constitutional challenge that we're facing and the nature of the threat that we're up against. Law professors tend not to talk like that. So I think one of the most valuable things that I can do just right at the outset is to say, like, everything you just said is right. Everything that you just said is right in terms of the nature of the threats, the constitutional nature of the threats, and the task ahead of us, which is to speak truth to power, which is to recognize that we are up against cruel, vicious people who are committed to lawless action, who hold their offices as a consequence of a constitutional violation. And we need to get creative and resourceful and courageous in thinking about how to respond and what actions to take.
Absolutely. And I've been so grateful. Thank you for that, Professor Bernick. And I just want to say I've been so grateful for your willingness to come on this show and be fearless about those creative mechanisms that we can use. You did it the first time back in December when you were urging Congress to reject Donald Trump's certification, as they should have. You did it again a few months back when we were planning our 314 Veterans March on the Mall. In bringing up the option of an amnesty act. And I want to really delve back into that with you today. But one of the things I really wanted to start off with you on is basically the drafting of the 14th Amendment, how it came to be, its significance historically in this country. Just with the underlying thought of how could we abandon this most fundamental aspect of our freedom.
So I think one underappreciated aspect of the 14th Amendment is that there's more than one section to it. Section 1, which guarantees birthright citizenship, which defines citizenship, and which guarantees to all citizens the privileges or immunities of citizenship, to all persons due process of law and the equal protection of the laws, is not the only part of the 14th Amendment. There are other parts as well. And those parts aren't directly concerned about rights. They're concerned about the structure of government and who gets to govern and who doesn't get to govern. The nation had just emerged from a bloody war about the nature of the Constitution, about the nature of citizenship, and about whether the Constitution, properly understood, and Confederates claimed to have the Constitution on their side, tolerated separate castes of racially defined people. Republicans built a political movement that was successful in capturing the presidency and ultimately successful in winning a bloody war. And after the war, they set to work not just ensuring that people's rights would be protected, regardless of race, but by building a structure of government which ensured that the kinds of people who took the field of battle in defense of the proposition that slavery was a positive good would never hold office in any capacity again. Section 3, like Section 2, like the rest of the 14th Amendment, is designed to ensure that people who are hostile to the freedom and equality of all people and who are prepared to use violent means to subjugate others cannot hold power, political power in the United States. And it's sweeping, It's broad and it's harsh because the stakes are that high. Now, thinking back a few years, we saw an assault on our constitutional order by a person who now stands at the head of the executive branch and can't distinguish African countries from one another, who inverts the language of genocide that we know is being committed in Gaza to manufacture a grievance right out of Stormfront in terms of its sourcing. Unambiguous white supremacy. This is exactly the kind of person and the people who run his departments and who lie in the name of the Constitution about their power to subjugate other people are the lineal descendants of the people that Republicans structured the 14th Amendment to keep from ever holding office. That's where we are. That's where we are. And it's a grim place to be. One of the things that I've come to appreciate just in the last couple of months in the course of my own scholarly research is that literally every group, no matter how nasty, no matter how far, the extent to which we can look at them and say they were the bad guys, they always claim the Constitution. The Ku Klux Klan claimed the Constitution. They just didn't think the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were part of it. So it's a dark, and I don't even want to say it ironic, predictable consequence of effectively ignoring Section 3, which prevents white supremacists from holding power, that we now have a white supremacist in chief and people like Stephen Miller trying to discern and interpret his commands.
I had Richard Painter on a couple weeks ago. I was telling you this over the phone, and he reminded me that in Germany in the 30s, Hitler would not have been able to take power if they had a 14.3 in their constitution, if they had an amendment barring insurrectionists, because like Donald Trump, Adolf Hitler engaged in an insurrection to try to stay in power before he ultimately took the power that led up to the Holocaust. I mean, the historical warnings and parallels of not invoking the power of Section 3 could not be more stark.
And like our current, I don't want to call him a president, Hitler was a clown, a buffoon, a grievance monger, couldn't be bothered to pay attention to what was going on in the details of an administration. People laughed at him. He would rouse himself in the afternoon to give speeches, didn't pay attention to official reports, but had a burning hatred for people he considered subhuman, not people at all, and felt free to delegate to fellow anti-Semites broad discretion to do what they wanted, regardless of any legal constraints. And you feel almost crazy talking about it. But we have to talk about it because the parallels are right there. And you're right that we do have a constitution that we can invoke, that we should invoke, regardless of what the Supreme Court is prepared to do with it, although in the last couple of months, we're getting a sense that they may have had some misgivings about just how much power they were prepared to give this guy. But we, the people, ultimately determine what the Constitution means and doesn't mean. If we act in the belief that this guy has no legitimate power, we challenge him at every step, then we have the force of law behind us, even if we don't have the Supreme Court behind us.
Yeah, I want to talk about creative ways, because when I think about Section 3, and this is kind of why I have spent so much time recently on impeachment, because there is actually a removal mechanism in the impeachment clause. Section 3 does not have per se a removal mechanism. Now, I've had this conversation recently in regards to, let's say, the Coy Griffin case in New Mexico, where he was removed from office. Now, as far as I understand, there was a state quo warranto statute that enabled removal per
Mhm.
Section 3. But on a federal level, is there any removal mechanism that you can conceive of that is baked in to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment after a president or after a federal official is in power in violation of it?
So here's the difficulty. There's not something that I can straightforwardly point to. There is a federal quo warranto statute. However, it has been interpreted effectively to only allow the attorney general to bring quo warranto actions. And I think you can imagine the problem here.
Right.
The attorney general of the United States, Pam Bondi, is not going to bring a quo warranto action to eject her boss. So we are in a place where I, speaking as a constitutional law professor, can say we are just in uncharted territory, and we've got to create our own ways of trying to figure out how to get something in front of judges who are increasingly just realizing that they are up against fascists who do not care about the law and are prepared to offer temporary, issue temporary injunctions, like as soon as they even skim these things, because it's so obvious. Like in the case of the Harvard order yesterday, like this is obviously a violation of the First Amendment. Obviously, there's no statutory authority to do what the administration is doing and just cancel the ability of foreign students to visit the country for their education. We are looking at courts that are increasingly sympathetic because even those who told themselves, unwisely, we can normalize this, it's going to be okay, are realizing that no, it's not going to be. It's not going to be unless we keep pushing.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one thing that I pointed out on this show early on before this illegal administration took power. I highlighted an article that, again, harkened back to Nazi Germany, and it said that Hitler could not have gotten where he got without lawyers and judges. Lawyers and judges made it possible. And on that theme of, judges being more inclined now to, to not cede their own authority that is vested in them in the judiciary and the duty that they have to uphold the Constitution. Hi, Argo, your dog. he's always a very very welcome guest on Lights On too. We know he loves to be part of the show.
Who knows what he's barking at?
Shouldn't there be, and I had so wished that by now we would have seen a Section 3 litigation, either brought, preferably, I think, by a state AG, some entity with gravitas to bring forward a case that says this action is not just in violation of the Constitution because of X, Y, and Z, but this is a violation because this administration is illegal and disqualified.
Right. So we know that on a daily basis, the administration is doing lawless thing after lawless thing after lawless thing. Mm-hmm. And what I think is going on is that people who recognize the nature of this administration are trying to pick their battles as carefully as possible. Low-hanging fruit is what they're looking for. This order, this policy, this thing, without getting to the root of the problem. Because they have concluded, I don't think entirely unreasonably, that the Supreme Court, once anything involving Section 3 ultimately makes its way up there, is going to say, we settled this, even though technically they didn't. As you have explained, the court never said that he wasn't an insurrectionist, never said that he can lawfully hold office, just said that states couldn't remove him from the ballot. But the spirit, the message that people got from that decision, and Chief Justice Roberts and the court owns this, is that don't come to us with your Section 3 claims. This is done. And that's what I think a lot of people have just calculated, and so they're focusing on the fruit rather than the poisonous tree.
Yeah. Then Bowden-Paulson described it as a shot across the bow, which is exactly what you're describing. People are afraid to bring this challenge back. Right now, excuse me, I have the legal authority page from nowmarch.org up on the screen, which is the website for the 14th Now movement. You can go there to the nowmarch.org legal authority page, One of those references is from an interview I did with Evan, also from Professor Tribe, John Bonifaz, William Bowden, Michael Paulson, who are the preeminent scholars on Section 3. And that article that is linked, the first reference there, to me is like essential reading for anyone who is contemplating Section 3, because there is absolutely nothing stopping them from bringing a challenge. Nothing. And it's really, really a shame. I want to ask you a little bit more about the litigation, because so many people come to me, Evan. There's some individuals who have filed pro se lawsuits in court trying to get some kind of determination, some kind of, I don't know exactly the purpose behind this, other than a reaffirmation that Donald Trump is currently disqualified based on all of the adjudication that we already know of. Mm-hmm. I know that others are trying to gather parties and plaintiffs together to bring lawsuits, because at this point, I had this conversation with Professor Tribe months back. He said, once you have an injured party, right, the basis for standing in a lawsuit, once you have an injured party, that party could bring a suit. So it really doesn't have to be, a major entity like a state attorney general. It could be an individual or a group of group of individuals who has been harmed by one of his executive orders. Do you think there's viability in a lawsuit like that from individuals or interested parties?
So here's the problem. The problem is that what the white supremacist in chief is doing is harming so many people on such a broad scale that it's very hard for any individual to show that they have an individual particularized injury that they don't share with the world. And there are ways to overcome those hurdles, obviously. In the context, for example, of a ban on Harvard's program concerning foreign students. Well, Harvard suffers institutional injuries. There are other universities that the administration says it's going to do the same thing to, but Harvard right now, they can say, just because you let us into court doesn't mean you have to let everybody into court. And the problem with any case that's predicated upon Section 3 is that everybody is injured by having an unconstitutional precedent. And that's the difficulty. Now, there's actually an interesting case that Will Bode has written about. It's quite possible that Justice Hugo Black may have been appointed to the Supreme Court in violation of the Constitution. And a pro se litigant argued that as a consequence of him being a member of the DC bar, he had a discrete particularized injury that he didn't share with the world because the Supreme Court does regulate the DC bar among the other things that it does. But the court wasn't interested in this and basically dismissed it as a generalized grievance. So once somebody has taken office, the court has been reluctant to eject them. And particularly in the wake of Trump v. Anderson, I think that's the general message that lower courts have gotten. Like, we're not going to remove this guy from office. We're not going to try, because if we do, we're going to get summarily reversed, and the Supreme Court will eventually say, what the hell are you doing down there? Doesn't mean it's right, and it definitely doesn't mean it's right, but it does mean that I think people have picked other battles because they think that they're more likely to win them.
Can we get really creative and fearless for a second? I mean, based on his status as a disqualified insurrectionist in violation of the Constitution, could other people that have taken an oath to the Constitution? Now, I talked on the show about John Roberts violating his oath by swearing him in. Anyone really who has been engaged in validating his presidency, who has taken an oath themselves, in my opinion, has violated that oath.
Yeah.
But if we didn't have a Department of Justice that is completely lawless, controlled by completely lawless attorney general, could U.S. Marshals remove this man from the White House? Could he not be invited on Air Force One? Could any technical, physical barrier to him acting as president be taken by constitutional actors based on Section 3?
So here I'm going to refer you to what Bode and Paulson say about this. And I think I am recalling this on the basis of my memory of their discussion of it, because the oath applies and requires of every oath-taking official that they follow the Constitution. And as a matter of the proper understanding of the Constitution, Donald Trump is disqualified. They don't provide a lot of details for what anybody has to do by way of discharging their obligations. But they do say, look, you're stuck with that. Like, you got to do something. You can't just follow as if you are not facilitating the actions or failing to impede the actions of somebody who has no constitutional right to hold office. And like the scope and scale of that problem is so huge that it's difficult to, even imagine, Chief Justice Roberts saying, you know what, you're right. All of us have been violating our oaths for the last few years. And that itself, I think, just diverts people from even thinking about it. They're just like, no, that's water under the bridge. We've got to move on. Constitutionally, they can't move on. It's not allowed.
Oh, God. Yeah.
But they feel like they have to because everybody else is doing it, and the whole thing has a gravitational force, and so they focus on other things. Now, people cope with fascism. They say, well, look, everybody else is doing this. Okay, this isn't that bad. Well, this isn't affecting me. Well, I don't know those people. And you just tell yourself stories according to which, you can feel good about yourself, even though there are foundationally wrong things that are going on that you can't confront because you want to go about your life. And it's just very difficult to provide any advice about this. We have not encountered this in our constitutional history. We have not had an unconstitutional president.
Yeah.
And an unconstitutional president means a lot of other things. All of it follows. And you just get overwhelmed. And I think that because people are overwhelmed, they have just stopped focusing on Section 3, stopped focusing on this foundational problem, because there are other things that seem more doable. But it's still a problem. And you can feel this in oral argument when Chief Justice Roberts and the other justices are interacting with an administration that they clearly no longer trust. They clearly no longer trust this. They held that the administration violated the due process rights of people that it wanted to deport under the Alien Enemies Act. That the administration lied about what it was doing with the people that it wanted to deport. They don't trust them. But at the same time, the Supreme Court is part of the reason why we're in this situation, and they can't acknowledge it. I don't envy Chief Justice Roberts, but I genuinely believe that if Donald Trump doesn't get a decision that effectively, ignores a crucial component of the Reconstruction Constitution, and another decision that creates out of a whole cloth, out of nothing in the Constitution, presidential immunity from criminal prosecutions for official acts, Trump is not trying a lot of this stuff because he is not comfortable that he can count upon the Supreme Court. He's not saying, lower courts, I don't really need to pay attention to you. I can go to the Supreme Court and then maybe I'll follow them, because he doesn't feel like he can trust the Supreme Court. So we are in an incredibly difficult situation, but we are in a situation that the Supreme Court, in part, created for us by refusing to enforce the Constitution as written, and thereby paving the way for people who act in the Constitution's name to trample upon its letter and spirit to do precisely that.
Yeah. If we can just compare, your description of them wanting to handle the low-hanging fruit to handling a disease. If you just try to address the symptoms, and you never get to the cause of the disease, that disease may grow until it just kills you. you have to address the cause of the
Right.
disease. And,
Because
when,
Go ahead. I was just going to say,
yeah,
I mean, what the administration is doing is they are tapping into this dark side of our constitutional history that has never really, ever left us. The hangover from the Constitution that protected slavery, the pre-Civil War Constitution. They are invoking this in the name of an imagined past to create a despicable future.
Mm.
But they have those resources because the Supreme Court has let them have it.
I want to talk about the resources that we still have, and that we cannot forget that we have, not the imaginary, giving them more authority or giving a court decision more authority than it actually has, but the actual constitutional resources that remain with us. I promised my viewers on our 14th Now OGs, they've been coming to me with so many ideas. There's another one, and I see it in the chat, that I don't know of any way to do this, but a lot of the electors that were part of Donald Trump's electors that gave him this election, that were certified, were people who tried to engage in the fake elector scheme in 2020. And there are some lawsuits presently against those fake electors, some prosecutions. There's no notion that you know of decertifying an election after it has been certified, is there?
No, and you would kind of confront the same practical, if not strictly speaking, legal impediment, which is that the guy's in office and his people are in office, and no judge is going to issue an order saying get out of the White House to Donald Trump.
Right.
Even though they might have every right to do so. But no, I'm not aware of any of that.
Okay. And now the other thing that you and I have talked about is amnesty. This is, and when you talk about the Supreme Court is hesitant to address a situation that they created, I think about this with amnesty and the prospect of any Democratic lawmaker bringing this up, because they're all complicit, right? It would require first an immense act of humility and, admission of their own failure on January 6th of this year to bring up the conversation about an amnesty bill. And that's why I have largely on this show and in this movement that is Lights On and 14th Now shifted to impeachment as a remedy, because it is a definite remedy that these lawmakers can get on board with. Shame on them, by the way, for Evan, I got to tell you, my God, I've been covering impeachment for the past few weeks. We had a congressman on the show promising to invoke Rule 9 to force an impeachment vote. And the man was literally bullied by the Democratic members of his own party, progressive, moderate, across the spectrum, leadership, everyone, into not bringing an impeachment vote and putting them on the record. I mean, unbelievable. Yeah. This is the state of affairs that we're in. But there is still an opportunity. There is still, for all of these people who get out there on their high horse and, the so-called stars of the Democratic Party right now, who are so good at pointing out the symptoms of the disease, but don't want to get to the remedy, they could be championing an amnesty bill that would underscore that this man is disqualified, that he does not have a legal authority to be there, and that disqualification cannot be cleared without a 2/3 vote of both houses, as is articulated by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, an impossible threshold. You and I have discussed this many times. Failure on any level is a success with an amnesty bill, because you're not going to get 2/3 of both houses to clear him of this disability. Isn't this something that you want to get popular again, Congress? You want to have some popularity in the opposition when you should, against this wildly unpopular president, yet people hate you too because you don't have the balls to actually do anything. I mean, Democratic lawmakers could be championing an amnesty bill right now, couldn't they?
I mean, they could. And the 14th Amendment and the Constitution isn't going to go away. And somebody is going to lead the party that gets these people out of office and somehow, and looks back at this era in a way that's analogous to the Truth and Reconciliation that has been done in other countries, notably in South Africa, in the wake of, generational and lasting harm. I'm not analogizing the harms of apartheid to what we've experienced over the last few years, but I am emphasizing that there will need to be a legal and constitutional and moral reckoning with what has happened here. And there are going to be people who are going to lead that. And I would love for, an AOC or, a Bernie in connection with the anti-oligarchy thing that they're doing that's actually been extremely well attended, to recognize that, the 14th Amendment properly interpreted is an instrument against oligarchy. It's an instrument against economic, political, and racial domination. And there's nothing that would be more fit for the constitutional moment to come than an acknowledgement that the root of all of this was allowing, the lineal descendants of the losers of the Civil War to hold power. So yes, it would take, my gut reaction to all the opposition is, primary all these people, but I don't have that power. I think we might have to rely on out of doors, charismatic individuals who speak for movements against the kinds of people that are opposed in principle because, it would be inconvenient to just call for impeachment all the time, even though impeachable things are happening all the time.
Not to mention, it would be a great, gumming up the works of all of the insanity that they're trying to push through.
Right. And that's the other thing. Like the other side, they don't think twice about this.
Yes.
Like the DHS policy that just got enjoined concerning Harvard was total nonsense. It's got stuff in there about the Uyghurs, who the administration doesn't care about at all. The claim is that the Chinese Communist Party has a sleeper cell in Harvard Yard or something. It's utterly bizarre shit, and they have no qualms about just throwing it out there and saying, "Well, this is the law now." I'm not saying that we should crank out bullshit, but we should recognize that if we cross every T and dot every I, we're operating at a certain disadvantage because they have no such restraints.
Yeah, we absolutely, for God's sakes, have to start taking a page out of their playbook, as I always say, in so many ways. So yeah, I love the idea of amnesty. I know that you have been very involved in the birthright citizenship subject. I think have you filed amicus briefs in these cases?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has not yet decided to take up a case that addresses the constitutionality of President Trump's Trump's unconstitutional
Thank you.
Anti-birthright policy.
Let me just tee this up for a minute. So we basically had oral arguments was it this week or last week, where John Sauer, who, by the way, he's the guy, if you ever listen to the oral arguments in SCOTUS, that's the raspy voice guy. It's like PTSD for me, Evan, because he's the same one that argued the disqualification case. And now this man is the literally friggin' Solicitor General of the United States. Fucking insanity, excuse my language. But he is literally coming before the Supreme Court saying, don't actually address the issue. Don't address the merits of this insane, unconstitutional executive action to end birthright citizenship. Just ban federal judges from issuing universal injunctions. That is what they are trying. I want you to explain how dangerous. Universal
injunctions that would prevent this unconstitutional policy from going into effect. So I mean, it's very frustrating. It's very clear that the justices, or at least the ones who mention the merits at all, don't think that there's anything to be said for the constitutionality of this executive order. Justice Kagan several times said, look, assume you, Solicitor General, are going to lose. Assume you're going to lose. Like, there's no way she says that if she thinks that she does not have a majority on the merits for the proposition that this thing is unlawful. At the same time, there's a reason that the argument took 3 hours. because we're talking about, okay, well, given that we all probably think, except for the Solicitor General, that this thing is unconstitutional, well, what can federal courts do to stop it? If you've got an unconstitutional policy that's going to affect the whole nation, is it okay for district courts to issue injunctions that affect the whole nation and say, you can't apply this anywhere? Or can they only issue injunctions that bind specific parties in specific places who can get lawyers to litigate these cases, and then other people who can't, who aren't parties to the case or can't join the class that is affected by the case, they're out of luck and they've just got to deal with this unconstitutional policy for a few more months until the Supreme Court gets around to it. Like that's what we're fighting about. Nobody's defending this on the merits, but there's a real possibility, and I don't want to make a prediction here because I think that there's a great deal of division over exactly what's going to happen. There's a possibility that even though everybody knows that this is unlawful and they're eventually going to lose, it could go into effect in certain places for a time in ways that would drastically affect the lives of thousands of people. And the court is doing this thing where it's like, we realize that you guys are lawless and we don't trust you, but we feel that we can't mess up our normal principles of law to accommodate the fact that you don't care about them. And this is coming up in case after case. I will say that I am encouraged that the courts seems to be saying, look, we may not be totally on board with nationwide injunctions, but we've got these things called class actions, and we're going to be encouraging district courts to certify very broad classes of people so we could get the same results, that this policy can't go into effect on a broad scale, even if it's not technically a nationwide injunction. I know this is super boring and procedural, but this is literally what we're fighting about.
It's really scary because, I mean, the ramifications of a decision like this that said federal courts could not issue universal injunctions, I mean, this could go well beyond even the obscene subject of denying birthright citizenship, right?
Right.
I mean,
So like, the classic example that everybody calls to mind because it really illustrates the problem is massive resistance to Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court issues a decision saying segregation in public education is unlawful. And what do Southern states with segregated schools do? They say, well, that decision only binds Topeka, Kansas schools. We got schools in Missouri. We have schools in Tennessee. Well, those people need to go into federal courts and seek relief. And in the meantime, the children have to go to segregated schools. And we now look at that and we say, well, that's crazy. The Supreme Court gets to say what the law is in a way that can bind the entire nation. What S.G. Sauer is now saying is, well, actually, maybe we're okay with the Supreme Court desegregating schools, but we're not okay with the Supreme Court saying you can't apply a policy that guts another part of the 14th Amendment. So that's where we are. It's not a great scene, but I will say that I have seen enough optimistic takes on what happened at oral argument that I'm not going to make a prediction that it's going to come out okay. But it does seem like the justices are coming to some kind of awareness of the problem that they're confronting, even though, as we both know, they're unwilling to do the fundamental things that are required to really solve it. It's too late, frankly, to do that. They've created this problem. It's here. We can't go back to before Trump v. Anderson. Our best hope now is to mitigate damage.
Mitigate damage. All right. So I know we have been all about the 14th Amendment today, but last time you were on, you brought up the subject of impeachment. And it is, once again, it's a constitutional demand. It's in there. We either have a constitution, like my friend John Bonifaz says, or we don't have a constitution. We either have an impeachment clause or we don't have an impeachment clause. What are your thoughts on the mood for impeachment and whether or not now is the right time? Is now the right time, Professor Bernick?
No. We should be impeaching all the time. We cannot get used to this shit. We cannot turn impeachment into this thing that we only bring out for the really big deal constitutional violations, as if there's a distinction between the not impeachable constitutional violations and the impeachable ones. It's exhausting and you feel ridiculous saying, okay, I woke up this morning or I checked the news this afternoon and there's another constitutional violation, something else that's impeachable. We've got a gift of a plane. Okay. Well, that's unconstitutional too. oh, the DHS secretary is saying something ridiculous about infiltration of Harvard. Oh, well, that's unconstitutional too. But we have to keep saying it. Look, this is unconstitutional. This is unconstitutional. This is impeachable. This is impeachable. Otherwise, we can expect to just get used to this and go about our business. And then we don't have a constitutional order worth preserving anymore, because we've defined constitutional violations down to the point where, like, the only thing left of it is that every state still gets 2 senators.
Yeah. I had Representative Tanadar, the one who filed articles of impeachment before Representative Al Green, on this show 2 weeks ago. He committed to invoking Rule 9 on this show. Within days, he invoked Rule 9 the next week, and then he blinked. As I said earlier, he blinked because of the unfreaking believable pressure from his party. And I just, I'm looking, maybe you can help me. I'm looking for some pop culture reference, like in a movie or something, where like the nerd is getting bullied by all these people, and then he comes out like the hero. I wish this representative would understand, because this is the way he was being treated. He was being ridiculed. He was being called idiotic. He was being called stupid and annoying and all these other things. He was ridiculed and bullied into pulling back his invocation of Rule 9. And
Right.
I just want this man to understand, and like anybody who could possibly foresee themselves in his position, what an effing hero to the people they would have been or will be when they actually have the courage to do that. Like, screw your stupid, out of touch colleagues in Congress who can't read a fucking room, and do what the people want. Like, you will be a hero.
Right. I mean, you go back a few years to go to Senator Booker at Justice Kavanaugh's hearing. This is my I am Spartacus moment.
Yeah.
Haven't heard from him lately about this. Yeah. You could dote on the line of people who, like, you thought you could trust, or you thought, they got it. And then, I'm not going to list all the names here because I literally can't think of them all. Week by week, people just cave and capitulate and tell themselves stories about how, well, ultimately, they're still resistance warriors, even though they don't seem to be resisting. And, they're cowards. And I don't say that I do say it as a criticism of them, because they're cowards. There's no way to get around that. But it's not so much my throwing an insult as describing the reality that you had principles and you found that they were less important than your short-term material interests. And you told yourself a story about how actually it was consistent with your principles. That's what's happening here.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we were going to hold Representative Tanadar to account, and hold the whole friggin' Democratic Party and Republican, all of them, anybody who's sworn an oath to the Constitution. And I'll tell our audience in a minute about the full circle we're going to do on impeachment next week. But Professor Bernick, Evan, my friend, always a pleasure. So happy to have you on and have your creative, fearless, out of the box takes. For God's sakes, we need to start employing some of them now.
Thank you so much for everything that you do, Jessica. What you do is incredibly important, and I'm glad to be here anytime to talk through the mess we're in.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And tell Argo I said hi, and the baby.
I will.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye. As I mentioned, we're going to have a full circle moment next week on Lights On with impeachment. We really want to delve back into that. I'm not letting that go for 1 second. So we're going to have Gabe Garbowit from Citizens Impeachment back on the show at some point next week, probably a little bit earlier in the week. So definitely look forward to that show with Gabe. We're going to definitely keep pressure and hold them to account. I know Citizens Impeachment is on board for that. I know the May Day movement is definitely on board for that. We are not letting this conversation go for 1 second. It's what our Constitution demands, and it is what we demand. I have a little announcement for you. I'm going to be part of a town hall that's happening on June 3rd, a virtual town hall called Their Service, Our Promise, for veteran and military families, hosted by the Democratic Veterans Council of Florida and the Florida Democratic Party. I will be there. Colonel Alexander Vindman will be there. A number of other speakers, Phil Air Force vet who's running for Congress in Florida. Really honored to be part of that town hall. As you know, when I organized the Veterans March on 3/14 in honor of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, there could be nothing more indicative of our our gratitude for veterans and their service and sacrifice to this country than actually upholding the Constitution. And if you're not upholding the Constitution, then don't pretend to honor veterans, because you don't honor veterans. So thank you all so much, as always, for being with me here on Lights On. You know, the best way to support this show is to subscribe to the Jessica Denson YouTube channel, if I didn't mention it already. Like, share, turn on your notifications so you know when I have a new show, always here on Fridays, but often come to you throughout the week. So definitely turn on those notifications. And if you want to support me directly, you can do that. And I need your support at thejessicadenson.com/donate. thejessicadenson.com/donate. At thejessicadenson.com, there's also a shop where you can buy the Lights On merch. I make my merch through Fourth Wall, and there's also a link down there if you're ever in a position where you want to make your own merch. I've definitely found that it's the easiest way to make merch and to make it available for you guys. So I do it through Fourth Wall, and that link's down there in the description too. Actually, before we sign off, let me just put the link to that town hall in the description for you, and I'll drop it, or in the chat, and I'll drop it in the description before we end as well, so you can sign up there, and I hope to see you on June 3rd. Okay, my friends, stay in the light, know your power. As always, let your light shine.